Hey, welcome back or welcome to the Growth Project podcast by AMPLOS. My name is Dr. Cory Shaffer, here today with Dr. Milt Lowder. Milt, hello.
How you doing?
I am doing well. If you're tuning into us, it's because you're interested in pursuing better. That's what we're all about. So we got something for you today that will hopefully add to your knowledge base, something that you can apply in whatever industry you are in. So, Milt, I got something for us today. Came across an article. It was written a couple of years ago. I'll give credit where credit's due. Steve Magnus is the name of the writer, author. He's written a couple of books, but coming from the website, The Growth Equation, a really interesting article, and I thought highlights in a really, really simple way the role that we play for a lot of our clients. Certainly in the world of sports, but also in the corporate setting as well. And so the title of the article says, "Negative pregame speeches don't work. Here's what does." And so, of course, this caught my eye. Again, just given the work, especially we do in sports, read through it, a lot of really interesting stuff. So we wanted to share some of this research that's pretty fascinating and maybe turn some, I guess, intuitive knowledge on its head a little bit, especially in that world of sports, but then also did a little bit of research to see what this might look like in the corporate setting and found some evidence there. So, Milt, thoughts here before we get going?
We fall into traps of doing things that we think work for us. And we can see it so many times as leaders and coaches, Cory, even parents at home, leading and coaching from a position of fear, a position of weakness. We point out what could go wrong. We point out negative things. We point out what may be obvious, and we compare ourselves to the other team, to the market, to other people. And what I think this article does a great job of, there's a time and a place for that. As coaches, you get to evaluate. There's a moment to watch the film. The film doesn't lie. But when is the timing of that? What is the purpose of that? What are we really trying to accomplish? I think it just also reinforces what we talk about all the time, that who you are and how you show up as a leader, as a coach, is just as important as what you say. And so we know they're going to pay more attention to what you do than what you say. And so this really highlights the importance of being balanced and understanding what we're trying to accomplish. So I look forward to the conversation. It's exactly the world that we walk in each and every week, each and every day. And I think our listeners will find great benefit of this at home and at work and the different roles that they play.
Yeah, so we'll start and just outline some of the research here. And again, the first few studies here that we'll describe are very specific to sports, so be mindful of that. But stay with us because we'll bring this back to the business setting. And a lot of this research is really looking at, again, the types of pregame speeches and conversations that are had within locker rooms. You and I have sat through them. There's a wide range of them. Right, but one tactic, I would argue probably especially in sports like football, they reference hockey here, rugby, sort of these violent, very testosterone-induced sports. Really common for coaches to sort of go this route where they almost deliberately want to put their players in this state of like, hey, look at what happened to you last week when we got beat. Do you want that to happen again? And so like all week, we're just going to hammer you with video evidence of like how bad you got beat last week. And you have to watch that again and again. And kind of the message there is just like, is that how you want to feel this week? When all the evidence is basically saying like, no, that is not going to help your players play better. If you're doing that throughout the week, especially if you're doing that on game day, it is not moving the needle in the direction that you want it to.
And I think what, as coaches and leaders, what I challenge our coaches all the time that we work with is, are your players winning because of you or in spite of you? And so probably that's the way they were coached, and that's what they think works. And so when they use that tactic, it's not working, and our players are able to overcome that. They're able to channel that adrenaline and overcome that and play well, but it's hard to quit doing what we think works for us. Mm-hmm. I think that's just kind of the remnants of this old school coaching, mental toughness, position of power, all these things we do, we aren't really thinking, why are we doing it? And what do we know now about the way the brain is working And what is it doing to our stress levels, our cortisol and our adrenaline and our testosterone? What's really moving the needle? But I think we can all fall into habits that really don't work for us that we think do. So we just keep doing them.
Right. So the first study here, it was done with hockey players. It says when they watched video of a recent victory, their testosterone levels shot up 44%. When they watched a recent defeat, there was no significant change in their hormone levels. It goes on, testosterone is linked to strength, but also in the short term, motivation, risk-taking, aggression, and performance. They contrast that by looking at cortisol, which generally is linked to anxiety, nervousness, rumination, and ultimately worse performance. So the hormone influence here is really what we're looking at. And even the influence that the pregame speech, the messaging, what types of video they're watching on game day or the days leading up to, that's what we're talking about here. That's really where the influence is coming. It's at the hormone level.
Yeah, and so I think, Cory, it's important for all of our listeners to think about, we aren't just talking about that rah-rah motivation. It's the whole setting. Like, to me, that last pregame speech is the icing on the cake, but those words matter. That emotion matters. But think about how you're building messaging for your company, how you're building messaging for your employees, how are you building messages for your team. What are the constant ways that we're doing that? And is what we're doing producing cortisol or producing testosterone?
And the other study that went a little bit deeper here, rugby players watch video with the coach 2 hours prior to a game. The coaches either pointed out positive feedback, so where they had been successful and what they had done previously. And in doing so, there was a 15% increase in testosterone. Cortisol remained steady. Or coaches gave them cautionary and negative feedback, in which case testosterone stayed flat and cortisol spiked by almost 20%. And game performance followed those trends. So if they got the positive feedback, they tend to play better. The negative feedback, they played worse. Really, really simple.
Yeah, really simple research, but I'm just thinking of time. How many times have we seen or borne witness to, don't do this, don't do that. Why can't you do this? You can't do that. You can't do that and expect to beat a good team. You can't make those type of mistakes. Don't miss the kick. Don't jump off sides. Don't throw an interception. Don't do, what that does is now we've got research to support that it increases cortisol, and I'm more likely to paint a picture and develop the picture of what I don't want to do and how I don't want to play. That stress that follows cortisol makes you selfish, narrows your field of vision, limits risk-taking behavior. You're less willing to take risks. You're less willing to be creative. And we often coach and talk. I mean, last week we did the podcast on self-talk. We often talk to ourselves in that same way. Mm-hmm. Or as coaches, here's what's really important. We're feeling stress. We're feeling anxious. And so what we're thinking comes out of us. And that sets the tone as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to take a deeper dive into that in a second. I want to describe one more study because I think this just adds to this. No, you're good. And just like the further evidence for this. So they tested this now and the day of, we see that jump, we see that influence. But what about now several days later? And it's a resounding yes. Again, similar method in terms of showing players video, positive feedback versus negative feedback. But that difference in performance lasted a week later, which is fascinating. So a few days later, before a demanding workout, this says, the positive group had higher testosterone levels. A full week after the initial film review, the positive group still had higher pregame testosterone levels. And more importantly, they were judged by the coaches as having played significantly better during the game too.
Wow.
Think about that. And that's to your point. We're not just talking about one pregame message. This is the entire culture to a degree. It's the entire temperature of, in this case, a sports program or an organization or whatever it might be. Just day to day, that messaging, the type of feedback that they're getting, whether it's a little bit more positive and skewed towards, hey, look at all the things that we're doing great, or if it's negative and pointing out all the flaws and all the reasons we have to be concerned about the upcoming game or the next quarter, has major influence on performance.
It's amazing that impact and that criticism. There's a time and a place to really break down the film. We talk about evaluation versus criticism. This constant criticism and negativity has a long-lasting impact, not only on their performance, but who they are as a person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So now let's get back to what you started to take us down this path of just, I think in particular, the role of a coach, and for them to understand and just have some awareness around how much their demeanor, their emotional state influences players. Here, one research study is method. It says researchers found that whatever emotional state coaches expressed predicted the emotional state and the subsequent performance of their players. If a coach was angry, players grew more frustrated, made more errors, and were more likely to tank.
I mean, that right there, if I could give one piece of advice to any coach, any leader, we talked about Tasha Urich's research on self-awareness. Only 13% of us have a high level of self-awareness. And one of the things I thought about, the players are constantly on film, but what would the film say about you as a coach? How aware of you of how your stress is impacting you? I know in my life, Cory, when I get stressed, and I'm not really aware of it, and I'm not aware of how it's impacting me, I cannot be aware of how it's impacting our team here at AMPLOS. I cannot be aware of how it's impacting my family or those around me. So first and foremost is think about how I'm managing my stress. Think about how it's impacting me. What am I saying to myself? And how am I reacting to that? You get to be human. We say that all the time. But then, okay, with that, how am I going to handle that? How am I going to process this emotion? How am I going to get myself in the right mental state, the right emotional state, because they're going to pay attention to that. Mm-hmm. And if I can be in a positive state of mind, if I can be encouraging, if I can catch them doing something right, I have a chance to elevate their performance. And it's somewhat counterintuitive.
Yes. Now, we understand, too, that all this research, again, is talking about sports and talking about the influence of things like testosterone and cortisol and so on. The testosterone piece, again, for a lot of industries might not make quite as much sense. Yeah. Right.
Well, we'll go back. I mean, I think you're right, but let's look, what do we want in business? Here's what it says testosterone does: increase in motivation. We maybe not want the aggression, but increase in taking risk. And so I think the testosterone does elevate performance. Mm-hmm. Aggression may be not what we're looking for.
Yeah, I think the point is you got to know, and you said this, I think, from the start, like, what state do I want my team to be in?
Yes.
Like, when are they going to perform at their best, whatever their job, task, or role might be? So if it's salespeople, go take the risk, be a little bit more assertive in what you do, no doubt. But if it's somebody on the, customer service who's on the phone being yelled at all day, they don't need to be aggressive, right back. Like, they need to be more calm.
That's a great point.
So I think that's the point here. And, Magnus in the article does a good job of it. It's sort of reverse engineering. Like, what emotional state do you want your team to be in? And as a leader, you need to understand the impact that you have in the type of messaging and just your emotional state, and how much that's going to influence the group.
Yeah, I used a quote last week from Bill Walsh for our coaches about your best, their best, our best. And he was generally saying your lackluster preparation becomes their lackluster preparation. Your lackluster meeting becomes their lackluster interest in what you're doing. And so thinking about your emotional state becomes their emotional state. Your mental state becomes their mental state. So I think the power of this is what you're doing and how you're showing up is just as important, if not more important, than what you're saying and when you say it. And so I think that mental and emotional state, how do you want your team to show up? What do you want to be known for? And then we kind of create that in ourselves and in the culture that promotes the performance of the team.
Yeah. Why do you think you mentioned it a little bit ago, but why is it that so many coaches, leaders, why do they default back to this cautionary, almost negative place as a means of motivation?
One, I think it goes back to what we know about the brain and how our brain is wired to protect us from threat. Mm. And so we're constantly looking at, and I think that fear of loss, like if our team makes a mistake, if we show up, just not even aware of what that means about my coaching. So this protectionary piece, it's the absence of coaching free. It's the absence of playing free. We're trying not to make mistakes. That's why John Wooden's quote, the team that makes most mistakes usually wins. Coaches hate that. Because it goes again, if we just don't beat ourselves, if we just don't lose to Clemson, if we just don't do this, it's always what we don't do. And I think that's how they were coached. And it's just how our brain is wired to protect us from the threat. The threat is we aren't going to play our best, or if we do this. I think that's why. What would you say?
So now your players are wound a little bit tighter, and they're afraid to make a mistake, so they're not playing fast. There's a hesitation, a timidness around everything that they're doing.
Go back to the brain even on that before you offer your piece. Just think about our quarterback. If he's under stress, what does stress do? It narrows your field of vision. And so I'm not even going to be able to see the whole field. I'm not going to be able to see the big picture. Mm-hmm. So especially maybe even if you're coaching different positions on the field, what is that stress level doing? How is it impacting their ability to even just play their role?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it, again, unfortunately, is just, the culture of like toughness and stuff that's born out of like old school coaching, which at this point has pretty much been debunked. Like, it doesn't work. There are better strategies out there. But there's a level of, to a degree, unfortunately, it's like, well, this 50-year-old coach, when they were coached this way 30 years ago, that's, what it looked like for them. And so they kind of just revert back to what they know. Yeah. And it's a whole lot easier to just yell and make a big scene as opposed to, think a little bit more strategically about what does my team actually need from me?
And what do they need to hear from me in that moment?
Yeah.
And it's a whole lot easier to react than respond.
Right.
And then go back to what we know about just behavioral psychology, Cory, intermittent reinforcement. Every now and then I chew my players out. Every now and then I throw out a cautionary statement. And you know what they do? They respond and play great.
Yeah.
And so my interpretation of that's why I ask all the time, are they winning because of you or in spite of you? If I get on my players and I chew them out and I create this stressful environment and they played really well, what is my interpretation? Man, I did a great job.
Yeah.
I got to stay on my team. I got to drive it's all on me. So they carry that burden to their team, but they're thinking it's worked.
Yeah. The other piece of it too, I think it goes down that same pathway is, and Magnus talks about this in the article, the feel-good effect on the person giving the speech or delivering the message. Is it's almost like it makes me feel good to do it this way. Like I feel accomplished as a coach if I yelled during pregame. Yeah. As opposed to like, hey guys, I don't have a ton to say. Like I believe in you. We're prepared. We've seen it on film all week. You guys have put it on. We've practiced on the field. Like we're ready to go. Yeah. Like I don't have to yell at you for you to be ready to play right now. I know you're ready to play. Like there's an accomplishment almost around like, did you see me yelling there? Yeah. Like I got them going. Yeah. So I feel good, but do I understand how it actually impacted my players?
But even if we're yelling, what are we yelling? Like I watched our locker room on Saturday pregame and it was great energy. And Coach Sweeney came in, I hope, like inspired. And so that mental, if you want your team to play inspired, then you have to be inspired. Mm-hmm. You have to be motivated. If you want to drive the energy, and it says even that short-term performance for a game like football, maybe you need a little bit more testosterone. You need a little bit more aggression. But if my energy conveys anxiety and my words convey criticism, that's what we're saying to avoid.
Yes,
because then I'm increasing the cortisol.
Right. Absolutely. And I didn't mean to say again. There's a time and a place to give kind of the kick in the butt to get them going.
Yes,
I'm all about that, and to get just energy up and so on. And you're right. The research does support that. It's about just the negative, the cautionary stuff. The don't do this, don't do that. That's the piece that we want to try to cut out. Yeah. And I think we were talking about this before we jumped on here. I think, if anything, this further informs what we do, because you're never going to be able to get away in the college football setting. Just to stick with that for a second, like you got to go back and watch film.
Yeah,
there needs to be like, hey, we need to understand our mistakes. We need to correct them and so on. But really quickly, let's like turn the page and now start building our guys back up around all the reasons we have to feel we can be successful this week.
Yeah. And those things have to be within your control.
Yes.
And they have to be related to effort. Mm-hmm. You even mentioned earlier as we were talking about this, how important it is to catch. We talk about all the time, how do you develop a growth mindset and create a mastery learning environment? Catch them doing something right. Mm-hmm. And the lasting impact of catching them doing something right has far greater long-lasting performance effects than being that critic and catching them doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. Anybody can be a critic, Not everybody can be a coach.
Yeah. And I think some of this just speaks to, depending on the scale that we're talking about, the industry and so on, but just like knowing your team, knowing your personnel.
Yes.
Right. I mean, for
Yes.
somebody who's already, let's say, sort of high strung or high anxiety, the last thing they need to hear from you is a cautionary tale about what could go wrong. I mean, their cortisol levels are probably already elevated. What do you think's happening to those things, man? And just the confidence, how that's probably deteriorating every time they get that message of like, hey, let's not mess this up like we did last time. Like, man, that's the worst thing they can hear.
And your brain is going to develop the most dominant picture you paint with which you attach the strongest emotion. That emotion that we're invoking is fear, which is one of our strongest emotions. So my brain is constantly going to develop that picture that I paint. And so we believe the art of coaching and the art of leadership is knowing when to add pressure, knowing when to take it away. So the timing of when to add pressure and when to take it away is knowing your team. Mm-hmm. And if your team, as you just mentioned, is a young team or it's a big game, the bigger the moment, your job as a coach is to take away the pressure and free them up to play to win instead of playing not to lose. That's a lot of times what we do.
Yeah, agreed. And I think your sort of add-on or the reminder for me there a minute ago is like, doesn't mean that you can't have energy with the message that you bring. It's just being mindful of what's being said. And making sure you're trying to shift them into the right emotional state. So,
let me give an example of kind of energy interpreted or emotions of a coach correctly or incorrectly. So I was working with a coach several years ago, and his energy was contagious in a positive and somewhat of a negative way, and the team would feed off that energy. But they had a hard time interpreting the energy as confidence, that adrenaline is confidence, or as anxiety. And so he was adding stress, and so they would watch him and like, man, coach is really nervous about today's game. And so I kind of counseled him and said, what if we like just radically do something different? What if you just sit and just be quiet and remain calm and really don't show a lot of emotion the next time the team plays? And he did that. He was completely calm, completely collected, cool, just watching the team play. And I asked the players about it, and like, man, coach was really nervous because he didn't even move. he didn't even move. And so like how, like your players are constantly paying attention. Your team is constantly paying attention to what you do, and they're trying to interpret the reasons for your behavior. And so this coach tried to take away pressure, but it was so inconsistent with who he usually was, they thought he was really nervous about the match. Mm-hmm. And so really evaluating yourself as much as you're evaluating the film and how you're influencing your team and your players and your people.
Yeah. So I mentioned that we would shift this to the corporate setting. And so I did a little research here. I found one very interesting article. Again, this goes back to 2021. It's called Enhancing Employee Engagement Via Leaders' Motivational Language in Times of Crisis. And so this is perspectives from COVID-19. So be mindful of that sort of in the wake of COVID. But really, really interesting. I'll read here just a piece from it. This was from researchers at the University of Miami. They said, our results showed that leaders' direction giving and empathetic speech promoted employee satisfaction of the three fundamental psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. The three needs satisfaction further drove employees' adoption of control coping strategies to directly tackle crisis-induced stressors, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so the point is, and actually, leaders' empathic language emerged to be the strongest predictor of need satisfaction. So the very best thing that you can do for a leader, or as a leader, according to this, in times of crises, but I would argue it probably extends well beyond times of crises, but it's just be empathetic. Like that's what they're saying here. And people will feel more levels of autonomy, more connected, and more competent in what they're doing. Like they have the efficacy to do what it takes.
Yes, I love that language, efficacy to do what it takes. So let's think about just what empathy is. The best definition is seeing with their eyes, hearing with their ears, and feeling with their heart. And so as a leader, if I'm able to convey that, think about what we've talked about, mental and emotional state. If I'm empathic, they have a tendency to be empathic. And And what I like to say all the time, Cory, is stress makes you selfish. So if I'm adding pressure, if I'm adding stress, if I'm not connected to people, I'm increasing the cortisol levels. So it's made me selfish. I'm focused on me, and it creates separation from others. So the number one predictor of employee engagement and satisfaction is the leader's empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that empathy is what helps not only testosterone, but oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. And I'm not sure about if empathy helps drive testosterone. I probably misspoke there. But it creates oxytocin. That's the bonding hormone.
Yep.
So one great way, again, the overwhelming, like what we're trying to get to today, how you show up and how you respond to stress affects how they show up and how connected they feel and how they're going to compete and how they're going to perform.
Yeah. It's just really interesting. It goes on, it says, employees' sense of relatedness to their organization may function as the leading force that promoted problem-solving oriented coping behaviors.
Man, if there's one lesson or one word that we hear as a buzzword, what do we want? What do our organizations say we want? People that are empowered.
Mm-hmm.
What empowered people do, they solve problems.
Yep.
They're autonomous. They work with competence. And why? Because they're connected to a higher calling and a higher purpose within the organization. And this article, this research suggests that one way to drive that is for a leader just to show empathy.
Correct.
Just to give themselves and other people permission to be human.
Yeah, really powerful sentence. It says, it's imperative for leaders to take perspectives, show care and sensitivity, and provide social support to employees.
Yeah.
Very simple.
Yes.
But again, like that, and all this is coming down to, again, the title of this is motivational language. So the point here is that how leaders are talking to their people is influencing the level of engagement for the employees.
Yeah.
Like that matters. And that's the stuff that, I mean, we know this well, but is going to impact the bottom line, turnover rates, like a ton of different variables related to performance and revenue and so on.
Yeah, Bandura's, 4 classic ways of building self-efficacy. One is verbal persuasion.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like, I think this is what a great privilege we have as leaders and as coaches, to see something in someone they maybe have yet to see in themselves or are doubting it, and finding a way to bring it out of them. And the language we use and the emotions we convey that messaging with has a chance to build them up or break them down.
Yep. And so again, I mentioned from the start, I wanted our, if you weren't interested in our sports talk, like hopefully you hung around and made it this far to hear this piece, because it's the same, right? The research is so similar and just highlights the importance of the day-to-day, how you're talking to your team, how you're talking to your people. It really does matter, whether it's influencing them at the hormonal level or their psychological needs. It's influencing them one way or the other. And so let's make sure we're getting it right.
And how you're talking to them is a reflection of how you're talking to yourself. So go back to the self-talk, because the words you're saying to yourself either increases your anxiety or increases your confidence. And so how are you experiencing the threats? How are you handling your stress? Because if you're feeling it, they're going to feel it.
Mm-hmm. And so again, I think, as we start to maybe push towards close and wrap this thing up, I guess one of my final reminders is, people are going to make mistakes, players are going to make mistakes, but how you respond to those mistakes is really, really important, because you can teach and you can correct, but do so sort of from a position of strength and man, I'm excited to see what this looks like when we get it right next time, as opposed to just the yelling, the how could you possibly do this, the sarcastic comments that come. All that's doing is driving up that cortisol and making the player, the employee, whoever it is, terrified to make that mistake again. Yes. And therefore increasing, they make the mistake again.
Yeah. Curiosity is a word that we love, Cory. And I think that curiosity, you just said, I wonder what it would look like. Even as you're, let that be curiosity instead of criticism, comparison. I wonder what it would look like if we put it all together. I wonder what it would look like if we play our best game of the year. I wonder what it would look like if we practice with a purpose. And we tell our players all the time, a quote we use from Peyton Manning, that preparation reduces anxiety. And we want you as a leader to be prepared. How are you getting your mind right? What kind of emotional state do you want to be in? What kind of mental game and emotional state do you want your players and your team and your employees to be in? And then how are you setting the tone? By what you say and by what you feel.
Yeah. it just made me think. I used to play this video a lot for coaches from Pete Carroll. If you remember Pete Carroll, Seattle Seahawks, formerly USC. It's great because, and it's just like a day at practice with the Seahawks.
I remember
right?
that. Yeah.
And he just talks like he was a guy who was always just seemed to be so like relentlessly positive and always had this great energy and is always chewing gum like it's the last piece of gum he'll ever chew. But he just talks about the importance of and how him first and foremost needs to set the tone for the kind of energy that he expects to see in practice. He's like, I expect my coaches to be like running around the practice field and, being positive, having a lot of energy with how we do things. But he says more than anything, again, we hit this, but they focus so much on like, as opposed to correcting you when you do something wrong, just celebrating when you do it right. Mm-hmm. Like that was always the focus and the emphasis around just like, hey, that one was great. What were you thinking? What were you feeling on that one? Right? Like we really want to pay attention to the good ones. Most cultures, it's the opposite.
Yes.
The good ones, it's just like, we'll check the box and move on to the next play. The bad ones, we'll stop practice for 10 minutes to let you know you did it wrong.
So easy to do that. But what are we doing now? We're just increasing cortisol, making the outcome you want more difficult to obtain. What is Pete Carroll doing? He's improving not only connectedness, you mentioned that earlier, mm-hmm. but he's building testosterone.
Right.
And I would challenge all of us, what kind of culture do you want to be a part of? You're talking about employee retention, employee engagement, employee empowerment, turnover. What kind of culture do you want to be a part of? And then do a healthy self-evaluation. What kind of culture are you helping create?
Right. Any final thoughts, Milt, as we push this and wrap it up?
No, great job putting this together. I get excited, and it's challenging for me as well to think about what kind of tone am I setting, what's my mental and emotional state, and how am I using that to build confidence and to empower people to take risk and to think creatively and to dream big and to be who they want to be. That's exciting for me to think about AMPLOS, to think about my family, and think about the organizations that we touch. How do we use this information to challenge the leadership to set the right tone?
Yeah, well said. Well, that'll do it for us today. Thanks to our listeners for spending some time with us. As always, if there are topics you're interested in, if you have questions for us, feel free to reach out to us, hit us up on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Give us a rating, a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We'd love to hear from you there as well. And we will see you next time on The Growth Project.